Thank you very much, Katrina, for that introduction, and thank you very much to the OASPA committee for inviting me here to speak about this interesting topic. At least I find it interesting, and so do the rest of my fellow panel members. So we'll be having a massive discussion about it. So if we try and get a word in edgeways. As Katrina, did you mention my background's actually scientific publishing, which I did for sort of 10-15 years, and then recently I've become involved on a full-time basis with sort of research data, publishing, open science, those sorts of projects, and consultancy opportunities. So this is if you like, the result of some work I've done with the Belmont Forum, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, and I've also been involved with the Enabling Fair Data project. So there you go. Whistle-stop, I suppose, skeleton of the talk. It's fallen to me as the first person to speak in this panel to just flag up what fair data is, to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'll then talk about the funding consortium, the Belmont Forum, and what it's been doing about open data, particularly thinking about how that potentially aligns with fair data, and some of the challenges that I think are still ahead of us, which we're grappling with at the moment. So I'd really like to hear what people think about those. So first of all, fair data. So that's FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. It was, as a term, first used in 2014 at a Lorenz workshop, but the full principles were outlined in this article in 2016. So it's going to be a sense of the time frame. So it's really taken off since then, and certainly in the data and open science circles. I've also shown you the AGU logo. They've been running a big 18-month long project called Enabling Fair Data. They're a funded partner with the Research Data Alliance and also with Earth Science Information Partners, ESIP. AGU, in case you're not in that particular sphere, stands for American Geophysical Union. So it's a massive learned society that has about 65,000 members, I think, a huge suite of journals which are actually published by Wiley. And they've been trying to, if you like, work out what fair data means in the earth science space. So the way that the Enabling Fair Data project's been working, so it's got about 5 months left to run, is to think about policies, commitment statements, potentially tools, supporting materials, just things that can be practically done by various stakeholders in the course of actually making data more fair, again, in the earth science space. I've given you here, it's a passage from the commitment statement, which is currently up online, and I will be giving you the link to the full statement if you want to look at it later. I wanted to draw attention to the way that they've tried to break down the specific stakeholder sort of sphere of influence, if you like. So there's a paragraph for repositories, there's a section for funders, institutions, individual researchers, and also for publishers, as you can see here. And as you can also see, it starts off with "will strive to." It doesn't say this will happen. There's definitely recognition that this is an onward journey. It's an ongoing project. But as well as saying, this is what we want to try and do to make data and other research outputs open and accessible at time of publication as well. So it's also, if you like, implicitly saying we don't recognise it as being publishers' job to make sure that it's always open and accessible. We recognise that you can't necessarily guarantee that. But on the other hand, it also, as you see in the following bullet points, gives some indication of what are some practical measures that you can consider as a publisher, by becoming proficient and knowledgeable about what repositories to use. There's a repository finder tool which is also being developed by Enabling Fair Data, and again, one of my fellow speakers will tell you a bit more about that. At the same time, there are some shared author instructions which can be adapted. There's information about data citation practices, and also there's this idea that yes, this is something which will be an ongoing commitment, if you like. It isn't just we sign this, we do it once and we leave it. There's a review and update. sort of measure as well, which I think is, it makes sense. So that's what the Fair Data project, if you like, is moving towards, and that's the sort of the point at which they're at the moment. They're just starting to gather the signatures for the commitment statement now. So the Belmont Forum is, it is basically a consortium of national funders. It was formed in 2009. There are about 25 members. They include a lot of the countries represented here, and also the European Commission is itself a member. What it's sort of building towards is it's like large-scale, international, cross-disciplinary projects that look at sustainable development goals, global biodiversity, big kind of climate adaptation issues, and recognising that in itself is quite a big ask. They've also foreseen the necessity for, if you like, stewardship of what's produced in the longer term. It's not just about solving a particular question in 2 years' time and then we go on to something else. It's also what we've produced itself has to be reusable by us or by others. And as such, they've actually been spending quite a lot of time sort of thinking and speaking to various communities as to how they actually go about doing that. So the Belmont Forum itself developed its open data policy and principles, and these were published at the end of 2015. So in terms of timing, you see, it was fair data, if you like, was something that was sort of understood as coming, maybe something was going to happen, but the full set of principles hadn't been published at that point. And I think you can sort of see that in these, in that data should be discoverable. That's kind of like findable. Accessible is the same. Accessible here means open as well as accessible, if you like, which actually FAIR doesn't include. And some of the other, if you like, interoperable or reusable concepts, if you like, are sort of there, but they're not as explicitly drawn out by the Belmont Forum as the FAIR acronym. So these have been ratified by the Belmont Forum. So what that means is that the member countries, if you like, support these principles, and they've undertaken to promote them sort of to their own communities and to the grant fundees. But as yet, they're not enforceable. They want to make them enforceable, but how do they do that? They're going to they recognise that more work needs to be done. So what have they been doing about it? Well, they've been interacting, luckily, I think, with a number of other groups, such as the Enabling Fair Data Project, such as the Research Data Alliance. There's a really great interest group called Data Policy Standardisation and Implementation within the Research Data Alliance that the Belmont Forum has done some work with, but hasn't signed up to become a member of. And I think that's one of the issues that we will start coming across, because in a sense, in order to be autonomous yourself, it's like, at what point do you sign up to things? What point do you agree to be bound by somebody else's agenda or rules? And so I think at the moment it's very much what can the Belmont Forum adapt to, or nod to, or align with, without actually, if you like, committing fully towards. And the results of these sorts of discussions and research have been the adaptation of the language to the researchers. I think this is very important, that they've adapted language in the original calls. So when they're actually calling for proposals, they are being very explicit about data and about research outputs, not just being about scientific articles, but that there is a need for that to be considered from the very beginning. They've developed an interactive data and digital outputs management plan, which again they are supporting researchers once they have achieved the funding to populate properly and to consider and review through the say 3-year life of the project. And also, which I've been most involved with, and also some people in the room have as well, there's been the Data Accessibility Statement Project, which has been a group of the funders within Belmont and some publishers, sort of convened by myself and a couple of other people working for the Belmont, to agree on a template and policy for data accessibility statements, so that, the language and expectations that the researchers are receiving remains consistent to the point of publication, and also that a number of the publishers, hopefully, that are receiving this input from the scientists, from the authors, will themselves be expecting and will be able to accommodate what they receive. So again, this has been produced in talks with other funders, with the Enabling Fair Data Project, just to think about again how these communities can work together to make sure that the researchers, if you like, are not set up to fail. They're not given a nasty surprise at the end of the project, and it should be very easy for them to comply and actually produce something pretty useful. So, but I did say that there remain some problems, and I think these are some of the things that we're coming up. In a sense, Enabling Fair Data is a great project. It does only support at the moment the Earth and space sciences. This needs to obviously be updated over time. A big question about what data does it apply to is again, fair data pretty much. When publishers talk about it, it applies to research data associated with publications. When the Belmont Forum talks about data, they mean all data that has been produced as part of a research project. And again, that's something that I think becomes problematic. Also, Enabling Fair Data was funded by a private foundation, the Arnold Foundation. And it hasn't been something that's specifically been taken up by the national funders. So it's the Belmont Forum, with its interaction, as a consortium of national funders. What does that actually mean? I think, again, they haven't necessarily fully worked through. So for instance, if the French Belmont Forum member signs up to Fair Data, does that mean that all of France has signed up, or actually not? In which case, what's happening internally? How does that message work through for them? So. I think that, and also there's just the resourcing as well, and also the idea of what's long-term sustainable. What does fair data going to look like in 5 years' time? Well, there'll need to be a movement, and there is a Go Fair organisation that has already been set up. Is that going to be something that gets powered up more, that we become members of? And I think there are a lot of questions remain, but a huge amount of progress has already been made as well, which certainly I've been very happy about. And that's it.
So I'm going to tell you briefly about what the publisher role is or could be in enabling fair data, and I'll show you a few examples. I realized this morning that actually, this being the 10th COASP conference, I was at the first COASP conference on a panel talking about data. On balance, I think that's hopefully a good thing, and what we're going to hear about today and have heard about today is, I think, some of the exciting progress that has been made. Before I do that, I know that Fiona has described what FAIR is. I just thought I would show this to surprise, shock, or scare some of you, some of the detailed requirements of what it means to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So it's not just about putting data on the web. To make data findable, the requirements include having persistent identifiers, having good metadata. They don't include open license requirements. And I won't read the rest of these, but what I'm saying is, for certain research communities, making data findable, accessible, and particularly interoperable and reusable is going to be really flipping hard if they're not doing it already. So this is my personal perspective. So I had a little think about where data sharing is working, where fair data perhaps has become an established culture. And I think where data sharing in research communities works, I think you need three things. There needs to be a clear benefit to that research by sharing and reusing one another's data. There needs to be a culture of doing that that's ingrained in policies and practices. And thirdly, you need infrastructure, scholarly infrastructure, to enable the sharing and reuse of data to happen. And common examples of this in action are in genomics and in astronomy, where those communities need to share and reuse data in order to do their research. There was a report from JISC recently that tried to determine how much FAIR was being used in policies from policymakers and from other stakeholders. And essentially, I think what they determined is that use of FAIR as a term and implementation of FAIR at the moment seems to reflect where it's already happening. So we clearly have quite a lot to do. And what can publishers do about this? We can't address all of these three areas, arguably, but we can certainly have influence on them. So I think publishers can do several things, and I'm going to try and show you some examples of that. We can understand the problems, we can raise awareness, we can provide advice, we can provide third-party services sometimes, and we can also help generate more motivations and incentives to implement fair data. And we can also be open ourselves, and I'll explain what I mean by that shortly. So one example of understanding the problems that researchers have in sharing their data, as publishers, we often conduct surveys. Here is one example of a report from Springer Nature earlier this year. We wanted to understand what the practical challenges were for researchers in sharing their data. They're telling us, and this graph is telling us, that the top problem is organizing data in a presentable and useful way, or what we might call data curation, or less technically, they're telling us they don't know how to do it. But they're also saying they're not sure if they're allowed to do it, copyright licensing, they don't know where to do it, which repositories to use, they don't have the time, and they don't have the money. So all these problems, I think, should guide the things that we do to help support fair data. Raising awareness, I think this comes down to journal policies. I'm going to summarize this very briefly, but there has been a lot of development across multiple publishers in the last couple of years in particular on introducing data sharing policies to thousands and thousands of journals. And the approach we took at Springer Nature was to not have the same policy for all of our 2,500 journals in disciplines from humanities to high energy physics, but to have a common framework of data policies that had several options, allowing for different journals and different communities to adopt the level of stringency for data sharing that was appropriate for their community. And importantly, publishers are collaborating with one another on this topic of data policy, because I think this is often a prerequisite. You have to have the conversation, you have to raise awareness before you can look at some of the more technical and implementation details. Publishers can provide support and guidance, and of course, where it's appropriate to, we should be directing researchers to their institutions, which can also provide very good guidance and support often on research data issues. Publishers, Springer Nature, we have a help desk, so researchers, whether those are editors, often they are, or authors, if they want to know how they comply with the data sharing policy of a Nature journal, for example, we can help them do that. We also provide other tools and resources that might help authors find the right information. We have recommended repository lists, for example. We have standard guidance on writing these data availability statements, which is it's like an acknowledgement section for data, if you're not familiar with them, increasingly required in journal articles. But what we also determined, and what some of that survey data was telling us, is that some researchers are perhaps looking for a bit more hands-on assistance, a bit more support, not just being told how to do it, perhaps someone actually giving them help to do it, to share their data. And they can get that support from a number of different places. We introduced at Springer Nature actually providing that kind of research data deposition and curation support directly from the publisher, what we call a research data support service, which involves, at a high level, researchers choosing whether or not they need this help, providing their data files to the publisher, and then a research data editor or research data manager carrying out some curation and then eventually publishing their data and linking it to their article. And that's available to individual researchers, but we've talked about funders and institutions, I'm sure, a lot during this meeting, and one example of, I think, where publishers can collaborate with institutions, organizations, funding agencies, is to enable data sharing to happen more effectively. A couple of months ago, we announced a pilot partnership with the Wellcome Trust, where anyone with funding from the Wellcome Trust can avail themselves of the research data support services from Springer Nature, if that is a useful means for them to share their data if they weren't otherwise able to do that. A key thing with this is it's actually publisher agnostic. So regardless of where Wellcome grant holders wish to publish, they can receive research data support to help them make the data available, either in a way that follows best practice or perhaps in a way that is a requirement of a particular journal they're publishing in. Here's just one example. Wellcome Open Research, their publishing platform, has already published papers where authors have used this third-party support service to share their data. Moving beyond that, there's an awful lot of other innovations and experiments that multiple publishers are involved in, driving themselves or collaborating on. Just to whistle through some of the key ones, data citation. So I think we'll hear a bit more about that from Martin, but I think this is a really important incentive. It's a really important mechanism we can use that can encourage transparency, but then also potentially give more credit and recognition for data sharing, and also give us metrics of what's actually happening with that data. Data journals is another topic. A number of these are available. Scientific data is one that I know very well. Again, that's giving incentives through additional publications for scientifically important data sets that then get peer-reviewed. Other ways of looking at incentives are around badges for transparency, badges for open science. There is an open data badge, which some journals have experimented with. At Springer Nature, we're just in the process of conducting an experiment with one journal, a BMC journal, to see if open data badges encourage data sharing. My final slide. I said that we should be open, and being open is a means to support data sharing and a means to support fair data. And I mean that in sort of manifold ways. Because being open, being transparent, particularly given the fact that fair data may be a very alien concept to some communities already, is that if we focus on transparency, opening up what we can, then that's a practical and pragmatic approach to moving towards more fair data. And that can be done in several different ways. Of course, supporting open access, supporting open research is an important part of that, but we also need to take realistic steps in other ways as well to achieve, as a first step, often simply findable. So I think initiatives like open citations are really important. So if you do have lots of subscription content, is there information that can be shared openly to enable better understanding and reuse of data? I think open reference lists is important. Another example is the sharing of data links and identifiers from within content. There's a project called Scholix, or Scholarly Link Exchange, where publishers are collaborating to share persistent identifiers for data and articles that they publish. Another example, announced yesterday, the Nature journals put their data availability statements in front of the paywall for all of the articles that they publish. Again, taking simple, pragmatic steps to increase accessibility to information about data as a first step. And I think if we do that, then we can enable better understanding of what fair means and how it should be applied in different contexts. And finally, I think as publishers, we can be open with what we're doing and what we've learned. So things like making resources, whether those are policy texts or repository lists, available openly so that others can reuse them. Or if we're conducting experiments around new workflows or what have you, that we share what we've learned, both the failures and the successes. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Of course, I first have to set the record straight. DataCite is an organization that provides infrastructure, and we are not working with data directly. We're not a data repository, so there are many, many people that know much more about data. It just so happens in this room, the speakers probably know a little bit more than data, but that might also not be true, because I'm sure in the audience there are lots of data experts. In case you don't know what DataCite is, see us as a little sister of Crossref. We're also a DOI registration agency, but we focus both on research data as things we give DOIs for, but also the communities we work with are primarily data repositories, institutional repositories, and not so much publishers. What I try to do is two things. The first part is frame the problem. And I try to do it from a perspective of, if you come from an open access background, how does open data fit in there? And then the second part is about highlighting all the work that's happening. And I, of of course, only focus of what DataCite is involved in, and of course, also there's limited time. But just to show that a lot of things are going on in this space, and I hope we have a good discussion afterwards. This is just an example, and I picked random examples from publishers that are probably in the room of limited access because of subscription for DataCite. We are a non-profit, so we don't have any, we're not an academic institution, we don't have access to articles that might be relevant for us, in this case a project that we were involved in. Of course, there's all kinds of issues with licenses, and you know this much better than I do. In this case, there's a preprint with a CC by NC license, where I don't know whether I can share this in a conference where people pay registration fees. But what I really want to go to is open access content, but there's no data. This example is from 2009, where I think the data sharing discussion was at a very different level. And this is also, you can understand a lot using the figures and graphs in the article, but there's no data behind that. This is an example that's probably more relevant. This article has no data and makes important statements that have been sort of discussed widely. This article reaches 1,000 citations soon. There's no data that explain the findings, and for me, and at that time I worked in cancer research as a clinical cancer research, I cannot draw any conclusion from this because there are no data. And in this case, this is a very complex topic where a single table with some numbers that are not explained is just impossible, unfortunately. And it's sort of almost ironic that this is sort of used in a reproducibility discussion. Many people build things on top of this. The clarification you see is about this topic. But I think that's basically the problem, that even if you can read the text, if the data is not there, it's really something important missing, and depending on the subject area, that can be a small piece missing, or it's really, you cannot draw any conclusions. So my point I want to make is, this is not a nice add-on to have open data, but this is really needed if you want to understand a research publication. And in that sense, it nicely fits in the mission of people in the room and of open access. Obviously, that's a problem that's well known, and obviously lots of people are working on this. As far as policy goes, which is probably the starting point and the most important point, you have heard a lot by Fiona and Iain already, so I leave that to the discussion if you have further questions. One key problem, and it's a little bit sort of random what I present, because I wanted to focus on things I can squeeze into, I don't know, 7 minutes or whatever is left, and also talk about things that are fairly new. This is an example of something which will be announced tomorrow, which is, Fiona mentioned, is the AGU FAIR project. DataCite played a role there in using a Re3 data repository, build a tool specifically for researchers to find data repositories for Earth science and Earth, space, and environmental sciences data. And this is, of course, early in the work, and we hope this can improve over time, but that's one sort of gap that needs to be filled, that if you tell a researcher, deposit your data, you have to give guidance. And Iain talked about scientific data and the list of recommended repositories. That was the first, to my knowledge, attempt to do that. What this project is doing differently is mainly, and you see this in the screenshot, instead of having a list of repositories, having a list of criteria, which obviously is very much what FAIR is about, using persistent identifiers, making the data openly available, and of course, in this case, also a disciplinary repository for the geosciences. Another key issue in FAIR is, of course, having persistent identifiers for data sets. And as much as DataCite, we like everybody to use DOI. For research data, the picture is much more mixed than in the publishing world, and in particular, life sciences community, because they started this much earlier. There's a culture of accession numbers. And what we try to do in Force11, in the data citation implementation pilot, is to provide, to turn accession numbers in life science into globally unique identifiers. And this is sort of, this work has been wrapped up, and this publication appeared a few months ago in using compact identifiers, a service provided by EBI, in collaboration with the California Digital Library. A parallel activity in this project where I was directly involved in was not about identifiers but metadata. Again, if you use DOIs, you have standard metadata, but if you have a repository using accession numbers, to provide metadata, we came up after many discussions and going out of details. The best way to do this is embed metadata in landing pages, and in 2016 and still 2018, the best way to do this is probably to use schema.org and not some HTML tags. And this is something that's slowly picking up, but because Google announced their Google Dataset Search 2 weeks ago, we expect that this will pick up a lot of speed. I had discussions with some people in the room about whether it's a good idea that Google is part of the infrastructure. That's a good discussion, but the point here is that this is a driver for repositories putting metadata in landing pages, and we can all reuse it to make data citation easier. For example, that reference managers can directly pick up the metadata, etc. The coordinated publication of articles and data is very painful, and I'm glad that Elizabeth from Dryad will talk about this after me. It's much easier to publish data first and then sort of submit the data, for example, the identifier when you submit your manuscript, and there's, of course, that's common practice, but it's clear that this is not for everything. Something we, as DataCite, have spent a lot of time over the past few years and will continue to do so is linking articles and data, and in particular I want to highlight the RDA working groups. Iain also mentioned his colleagues. We're also involved in the Make Data Count project that combines data citation with data usage stats. And what we see so far, sort of in practical implementations, is that just focusing on data sets and articles using cross-server dataset DOIs, that the data repositories we work with spend much more time and providing these links in metadata that are open to all. So the numbers in the bottom are 4,000 links about from articles to data sets submitted to Crossref, and that's all of you, and about 800,000 submitted to DataCite from our members linking to Crossref articles. So there's an imbalance that's something that is also good for the discussion. For example, whether we want the publishers to pick up and go to similar levels, or whether it's just as well as has been in the past to just sort of find the link backwards. I think that's the last slide. Something that we have started to work on in August as part of the Freya project that Christine presented on Monday is to take a next step. Instead of saying we want to find links between articles and data, we want to think about sort of connections over multiple steps, and there's two relevant issues that we want to address that are important here. The first one is data set granularity and versions, which is that you can have many different versions of the data set. You can have sort of subsets of data that you can download and use individually. And a good example, again, is Dryad, that's doing the letter for many years. And there's a lot of fear in the data repository community that if people cite different versions and so forth, how you bring all this together. And instead of using one DOI for a whole database, the better solution is to use identifiers and link them together, and don't worry if you have 100 identifiers for different versions of a data set. So that's something we want to work on so that this becomes a non-issue, and you can use identifiers the way you want them, which means as granular as needed, and we can bring it back together at a later point. Similarly, lots of data are published as the underlying data for an article, and I use the term research object here. If you ask Jennifer Lynn from Crossref, she calls it article nexus, which is basically you cannot really separate the article from the data, and then of course there's also many other things associated like software, which means for us, if somebody is citing an article, we have no clue whether they're actually citing the data that's part of the article. So what we want to do is, instead of telling everybody you must cite the data, please cite what you always do, and we all know citation practices are crazy. And we just bring this together. And at least if the data set is clearly the underlying data or the article, we can just follow the links and say the citation to the article actually is also a citation to the data because the article wouldn't exist otherwise. And with that, I thank you.
So, I want to start by agreeing very much with Iain that FAIR is a very ambitious concept, as it should be, and it's actually quite a difficult obstacle to climb. And like a lot of things that you climb, it gets harder the closer to the top that you get. So, findable, accessible, okay, we can manage these things. Interoperable, reusable. I'm getting really tired. This is really hard. Luckily, our community is already starting to appraise the FAIR principles, figure out how to really define them, measure them, and make them applicable across disciplines. So the point of my talk is to highlight some of the ways that different types of organizations, different stakeholders in scholarly publishing can work together to find efficiencies and share resources and help us all sort of climb FAIR mountain together. So on a practical level, I would say that there are two things we can do to vastly increase the chances of data becoming FAIR. We can get the data, and then we can check the data. So in terms of getting the data, data is much more likely to be or become FAIR if it is submitted to an appropriate repository that is not only set up to handle and preserve it, but that has the resources and the connections to sort of keep up with the concept of fairness as it evolves, and to implement any technical changes that are needed to stay current with that. And this highlights a very key point that we can't be FAIR if we're not sustainable. Data infrastructure, staff, storage, curation, all of that stuff, it costs money. And we still don't have good models for paying for that in the long term. When it comes to repositories, the other speakers have highlighted some great options and a new Finder tool, which I look forward to messing with. Discipline-specific options are great in terms of being able to, in terms of being situated within their communities and being very reusable for specialists in that area. But again, we have the sustainability problem with those kinds of efforts. Otherwise, there are some great general purpose options like Zenodo, Figshare, Dataverse, and Dryad, which is where I work. So for anyone who may not know, Dryad is an open data repository that was founded in the life sciences, but has since become general purpose, broader. We're a nonprofit. We are community governed and supported, CC0 exclusive licensing, and we are curated. So we have a team of human beings that are processing every submission that comes in to the repository. Dryad has focused thus far on archiving the data specifically at its underlying publications, and that usually means journal articles. And we've succeeded in getting more of the data, in capturing data that might not otherwise have been deposited by partnering with journals to integrate the manuscript and data publishing processes. And we have this integration set up in place for more than 130 journals right now. So this graphic shows one option for how the two workflows can tie into each other. And the benefit of this is that it, oops. What? Sorry, skipped several ahead, okay. The benefit of this is that it capitalizes on the moment when researchers are already focused on disseminating the results of their research. And it works because it embeds data deposition into an existing researcher workflow. And it also works, or is working better and better, frankly, because journals are adopting stronger data policies, as Iain referred to. Integrating with the data repository like Dryad or partnering with the data repository can make this process much more convenient for authors, and it can help reduce non-compliance with a journal data policy. So Dryad has recently announced another type of partnership, which is with the California Digital Library. And the idea of this is to take this idea of meeting researchers where they are a lot further. So for one thing, with CDL's help, we will be able to meet a long-standing goal of integrating with publishers at the system level, at the manuscript processing system level, rather than on a one-off sort of journal basis. So with this future setup, a publisher could easily choose to integrate all their journals with Dryad at once, or they could offer individual journals the ability to simply flip a switch in the manuscript processing system and turn on that integration. Further, Dryad and CDL have plans to pool our connections and our expertise to develop community models for institutional Dryad services. So this means that institutions like libraries, laboratories, research centers can be involved in the preservation and curation of their data, the data from their institutions, in a space, Dryad, that researchers are already familiar with and are already using. And all of this really is about normalizing the practice of data publishing, convincing researchers that it's necessary to put their data in an appropriate repository. And in order to make that case, I think all of the stakeholders involved here, institutions, publishers, data repositories, funders, we all have to work together to make that actually happen in practice. So we've made some progress if we can get the data into an appropriate repository. But what if the quality of the data is such that it can't be easily extracted or understood or reused? So that's where the idea of checking the data comes in. And I mentioned before that Dryad has a team of human curators, and this is our current team of humans. So these guys are checking all incoming data submissions for things like privacy issues, copyright, reusability, et cetera. But I also mentioned that Dryad is a general purpose repository, meaning that we are dealing with submissions from a wide variety of disciplines, many data formats and data types. And these guys are pretty smart, but they are not experts in everything. So that's where another partnership comes in that I would like to talk about, which is the Data Curation Network. This is funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and we're currently just starting a 3-year implementation phase for the network, initial implementation phase. Dryad is one of 9 partners on this project, and we are the only current partner that is not an academic library. So these are the DCN partner institutions. University of Minnesota is the lead institution, and I'm sure you'll see immediately that this is entirely US-based, but that's just for this initial period. We do have plans to expand the network globally, internationally. So the Data Curation Network really began with this core belief that well-curated data are more valuable. Providing access is not enough. Curation activities are what have the potential to make data fair. However, the partner institutions also very strongly feel that we will not be able to scale credible, high-quality curation services if we work independently from each other. These services can't be fully automated, and it is unrealistic to expect that every academic library, every repository can hire a curator for every type of data or every discipline. So the idea of the network is that we are going to address this challenge by collaboratively sharing data curation staff across a network of institutions. And if this works, if it's successful, the DCN will not only accelerate local data curation capacity, it'll accelerate the capacity for better curation, higher quality curation, but it will also provide a model for collaboration between libraries and other types of data repositories like Dryad. So as I said, we do plan to expand to new partners. I think that phase would begin in around 2020. So what will this networked curation look like in practice? Well, as I said, we're very early in the implementation. And really, logistics are going to be the biggest challenge in terms of figuring out how to make all this work across a variety of institutions and the tools and practices that they already have in place. But what we have already done is put a good bit of thought and testing into the curate model, which isn't that a convenient acronym? I'm so happy that it actually works, and it really does work. So the steps are laid out here. And you can see that the very last step, the E step, is to evaluate and rate the overall data submission for fairness. And that's pretty hard to do. But what we're currently doing is basing that step on efforts in the community that are ongoing to develop tools and systems for rating the fairness of a data resource. And I think a working group, the Fair Metrics Working Group, just published yesterday a new tool for doing this. So it's a rapidly moving area, but we're definitely paying attention to what's going on in the wider community. Speaking of the wider community, this is just to highlight some of the other efforts that Fiona and Martin already mentioned some of these. These are other collaborative efforts and organizations that are working to achieve fairness. The work being done here is incredibly impressive, and I think it really represents the future of fairness. Yeah, I won't go into detail about any of those. So this quote is from that original 2016 article that Fiona highlighted earlier. Our community does have shared goals of more open, more transparent, higher quality research outputs. So I think we should commit ourselves to recognizing and acting on the ways that we overlap. Let's join forces when we can. Let's integrate our workflows when we can. Let's share our resources. And let's support existing projects and data infrastructure rather than always looking to reinvent the wheel. This is how we will gradually achieve the critical goals of fairness. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting talks. I have a question for Iain. You mentioned that to kind of move things forward, you need to, we need benefits for researchers, a kind of culture that kind of allows data sharing. And the infrastructure to make that happen. And I thought a lot of the comments you made around that slide could equally apply to open access. And one of the themes of this conference has been the slow progress of open access. I'm just wondering whether you see anything significantly different that would kind of accelerate the progress with fair data as compared to open access, or will we be here in 15 years' time discussing the same things?
I agree that there certainly are some similarities, and a soundbite I sometimes use in talks is that data policy is 15 years behind open access policy. That's an astute observation that the infrastructure issues, the cultural issues, what's the benefit? I hadn't considered that they could also apply to open access journal publishing. I wouldn't necessarily say that there are things that would accelerate data sharing, because I think I've already seen comments on Twitter that data sharing is easy and we should just stick stuff on the web. But the formats in which we're working with, the sizes of content that we're working with, some of the privacy issues with the content are, in my experience, more complex than perhaps what we've been used to with article publishing. So there's certainly things that we can learn perhaps in how we engage with stakeholders, how we take more iterative or agile or realistic or practical approaches to implementation. But I couldn't necessarily say it was going to be faster progress.
I have a question in terms of to what extent can FAIR be applied to the humanities and arts and social sciences, because this has very much been driven from the sort of life sciences and basic sciences.
Right. Thanks
Thanks
everybody. Yeah.
Iain, go for it.
So,
Martin.
I think you go ahead, you are the expert.
I think, as I mentioned in my talk, it would be difficult and perhaps wrong to assume that FAIR would immediately apply to all research disciplines. Having said that, there is a discipline, the digital humanities, and anything that is producing digital objects in principle There are aspects of FAIR which would arguably apply in terms of good metadata, persistent identifiers, but even before you have that conversation about what is FAIR and what does it means, people in some disciplines may be asking what is data, and that needs to be figured out before we figured out the optimal ways to share certain outputs.
I mean, there's been some work by Project Thor, which was the precursor to Project Freya, as also been mentioned earlier this conference. And the British Museum did some work around sort of historians and data, and if you like, trying to translate some of these terms and workflows to a more humanities-friendly based approach. And I think that it is very much a case of, if you like, just having a really fresh approach when you're addressing different domains. I think that is part of the major challenge. There are people doing it.
I just wanted to add that the social sciences are a very active community in data side, and sort of, I think for them that's sort of a natural way to move forward, different from digital humanities, because there is a lot of things that maybe started in the pre-digital time, but that sort of made the shift, and sort of the concepts are not always totally different. And there's also a culture of, for example, if you do a survey that runs 50 years, data sharing is an essential part of that.
I should kind of quickly mention as well, the Belmont Forum, because as I mentioned, it's seeking to build these sort of cross-disciplinary as well as international teams, and that it's basically it has to each project has to have people from different disciplines, and that includes each discipline has to have social scientists at least, if not humanities scholars, and they have to work together, and they have to come up with a combined data and digital outputs management plan that they can all agree on. So again, I feel like that's giving people, you're dangling the money in front of the people, and they will find solutions, which is part of it, I think, the incentives.
Does Dryad have any humanities and arts, social sciences data sets?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that can be more of a curation challenge, especially for human subjects related issues, but that's one of the major activities of our curation team, is working with researchers to get that data properly anonymized to the point where it can be openly shared, or if it can't be, redirecting them to a repository that is more appropriate.
Hello. My name is Barbara Kalumenos. I'm working for SDM, the International Association for Scholarly Publishers, so to say, another trade body, and I have more comment. I would like to share some information as it has been not mentioned. I just want to make you aware that because Iain he also talked about stakeholder involvement, be aware that the European Commission has the Open European Science Cloud. They have their declaration, and they have on top of this what they call the EOSC Declaration Action Item List. And we from the SDM trade body, and I think Iain, you have been involved in this, if I'm right. We look to this declaration list, and we have come up with 4 topics which we will in a way add to this declaration action item list. We have supplied this to the Commission now. It goes through a process. I hope that will be soon appearing. And I just want to make this community here aware. So I think what is important is, as publishers, we are trying to, it's one way of engagement now, because the European Science Cloud is one way how the Commission in a way is going to engage on fair data. And in this respect, I just want to also alert you, as we are sitting here in Vienna and Austria, that the presidencies right now with Austria, and in November the 23rd, there will be a big event here from the organized by the Commission, and there will be also the governance structure being announced for the European Science Cloud. So there's lots of happening also from the European Commission. I would not say it's like the Plan S, but in a way there's a lot of activity looking into data, and we from the publishers, and we have looked on what are actually ways on how to help and to support the Commission there. It's just a piece of information. I hope it's helpful.
I know the expert group on fair data have also fed into the Enabling Fair Data project in the AGU, so there's I think a lot of crosstalk among these
Martin Nix, Barstein Institute. I'd just like to ask the panel if they've got any suggestions for incentivization or improving infrastructure in areas of science where they're not particularly involved with data in general. In particular, in our case, it's organic chemistry, which is still very much like cooking in terms of how people record data. It's on their little lab notebooks with pencil and paper, and they transport that in perhaps to their data system. There's a lot of manual steps in there. And we're involved in the Go Fair Chemistry initiative and RDA and stuff, but there's a lot of problems convincing chemists to do their work differently. And I think, for example, the article that Martin mentioned on Begley, I mean, one of the problems there was simply people are not reporting all the data which is necessary to be able to reproduce the experiments. And that's what we have in chemistry. So we need a huge sea change to get people to move into a different way of appreciating what needs to be recorded and how to do that. And the question is, how can we get there?
One thing I would say that there's lots of parallels with open access, both the opportunities and challenges with digitalization, and sort of everything is in the internet now, but also the particular cultures in different communities. And chemistry, from what I can say from the far, is sort of a community where openness is not sort of in the DNA as in other communities as much. But I can also say from all the data repositories that work actively to link to articles, etc., the one that does the most is actually in chemistry. So there's always counterexamples for everything, and I think it's just a slow progress, which probably for data is not fundamentally different from open access, that incentives and things that have to be in place to actually implement these things, etc.
Actually, I was wondering if there's anything around learning societies that would help. I mean, if people are, if you like, seeing that a message from their own community. I'm thinking, for instance, the AGU has clearly really sort of stepped up and tried, if you like, to work with its community. As well as with other stakeholders in this particular project. But another of the actions they've taken is to rewrite their conditions for AGU fellowship, which now include a data stewardship facet. So in a sense, it's becoming, this is what our fellows are. This is what they do. So it's like redefining what a good scientist or a scientist who should be kind of honoured consists of. I mean, it's sort of quite general, but I wonder if that would be something that people might look at.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the other problems in chemistry is there are a lot of sort of legacy vested interests also amongst some of the societies, in that they have extremely valuable databases which are manually filled with information they extract from articles, and there's probably not so much incentive to change things if they're disturbing their current workflow, and making data available openly at an earlier stage, which could remove the necessity for such databases.
Yes, which has parallels to the open access industry as well.
Yeah, I guess it's worth noting that, and I think we've mentioned it a couple of times, but it's worth, I think, reiterating that fair doesn't necessarily mean open. So for data that for whatever reason are not publicly available, provided metadata are discoverable and indexed and have persistent identifiers, that can still achieve fair data.
Liz Ferguson, Wiley. I can also see a lot of parallels between open access and open data, but every single one of you has touched on the complexity of the material that has to be handled, the complexity of the linking environment, the complexity of the infrastructure that's needed to support data sharing. So between now and the halcyon endpoint, where we get to fantastic data sharing infrastructure for all disciplines, can you give us your views on the sustainability and churn that we might see in that environment as we make our way towards perfection?
Fiona, do you want
Wants
to
to
start?
start.
Me?
Oh, no,
Fine.
well, whoever. Barton.
Well, I think the big thing is for the stakeholders who are all involved to find opportunities to speak together, and if you like, at least agree on the direction that's being moved towards. And I think that there's been some legacy problems with some of the relationships, which I think actually a lot of the open access movement has done some work towards mending. I think people, when Robert Iain was here yesterday, there was a sense certainly in this room, in this community, of publishers and funders being on the same side, in wanting to promote open access. And I think that building on those sorts of relationships on things like, again, what we did with the Belmont Forum, where we had the funders and the publishers in the room together, thinking about the researcher's perspective, I guess, and trying to think about just making it so that the pipeline itself could become less prone to blockage or sudden contradiction. I think that there is a problem with the long-term sustainable funding, which itself also leads to a problem of trust, if you like. People who have their careers to build in research are not going to want to risk their reputation or other credit in the system by doing something that they don't necessarily know is going to last or do them any good. And I think that was something certainly I've been feeling around some of the panel this morning, where with the open access books framework already, and there are people saying, well, actually what we need is some clear understanding of what open access quality looks like, what an agreement looks like, so how it's going to be represented online. And I think the more agreements and sort of streamlined initiatives we can have, and more clarity we can provide, then that's going to go quite a long way.
I think from my view, there's one positive aspect and two negative ones. The positive one is that I think the lines of vested interest, or whatever you call it, are quite different than in open access. So I think it's hard to find somebody to say, I hate open data. What they will say, it's really hard to do. So I think there is a huge challenge, and to just pick one up that I think we have to solve is just the complexity of file formats, and it's just a total mess. So if you, as publishers, are annoyed by PDF as a format, I mean, you are lucky compared to what we have to deal with, so that has to be solved, and I think the solution has to be that we don't simplify it down to everything is CSV files now, and that of course doesn't work for many communities. And the other big unsolved issue is there's no money in supporting this. And because for historical reasons mainly, publishing people expect to pay for it, and data repository, a lot of them were sort of publicly funded, and they were just there. Nobody is really willing to put money on the table to deposit data, and I think if we don't solve that, it will be hard to impossible to ever get to the nirvana that you were describing.
So the question was about sustainability and churn. So I'm also interested to hear what Elizabeth has to say on this as well. But no one has found, I don't think there is a single sustainability model for data sharing or for data curation. Some services have a data processing, a data publishing charge equivalent to an APC. I've seen other examples where particularly high value data, maybe the reuser of the data needs to pay a fee in order to reuse that data for research. Where funding comes from is often unclear. I think there is some positive change. We recently tried to, at Springer Nature, determine how many funding agencies nowadays have some kind of open data policy, and it's about 85 or 90 that we think. And of those, about 20 or so of them do explicitly mention you can use your grant funds to manage your data or share your data, but that's still overall a small percentage of agencies. So this question of who's going to pay for it isn't going to go away, and we need to continue experimenting.
Yeah, I mean, I've been watching this Plan S discussion with great interest because, part of it is that funders are increasingly going to pay APCs, hypothetically. Dryad does charge what we call a DPC. It's different from an APC in some ways, and it's much lower than your traditional APC. But we have experimented with having a funder, the National Science Foundation, cover that fee directly for their researchers. And it's difficult. I mean, it's administratively difficult. So I'm very curious to see how this is going to get worked out with all the different journals, all the different publishers, all the different funders. Like, how is that money going to change hands? Because I know from experience that when the Gates Foundation pays a DPC, it's a pain in my ass. And it's for $120, you know, one payment of $120. But they can't pay with credit card, there have to be invoices, it's a very laborious process. So we have to come up with a different way to do this, I think, just financially and administratively.
May I ask the last question?
No, you may not.
Okay, well, she
You
was
have
my
to
boss,
jump
so
in with
she better.
Katrina. I'm Louise Page from PLOS. And so we've had an open data policy since 2014. And so we just crossed the 100,000 mark of data availability statements associated with our articles. And it has been through largely brute force that we've been able to do this, that we've encouraged people, but we've also had to manhandle this content and this data to be reviewed and to be made part of the process. And I really love hearing all of these different advances, and especially you, Elizabeth, in terms of where things are going with Dryad, because that's been part of the brute force that we've had to accomplish. But regardless, there's still a lot of people involved in moving this forward. And I wonder, do you see a point where there is more automation, that the compliance, doing the right thing is hard, and so the compliance that we're looking for from our authors and from the researchers is something that they can attain because it doesn't require quite so much brute force. But do you see that easing at some point or continuing for a while longer?
I do. I mean, that's part of the plan that I was mentioning is, the integration setup we have with journals, as Martin said, it's quite painful. It's difficult to set up on their end, and it's largely based on email because that's something that really any journal staff member is able to set up and handle. If we can shift to using APIs and different, at a much higher level, sharing information more automatically, just share it immediately without, waiting for acceptance or, let's just build all this into the workflow. I think it's going to make a big difference. And if somebody, who's submitting their manuscript can just go right over to Dryad or to whatever repository they're working with without switching systems and logging in again and, all of those barriers that pop up, I think all of that could make a big difference.
Yeah, just to support what you're saying, I think at the moment it is just too hard. I know we've talked about sharing data all along the research workflow, but what I see is that researchers are more willing to do it when their paper's been accepted. And at the moment, typically the integration between third-party services, submission system, repository is not sufficiently visible or friendly enough to just make it easy. As easy as uploading a supplementary file. If we can break that system, then maybe this improves.
Very quick.
Yes, also, I think what's also been mentioned in passing today, and also if people have been looking at the Twitter feed, they might have seen that I uploaded my presentation slides to Zenodo yesterday. And in fact, I got an email today from ORCID saying that my ORCID record had been updated. And there it was in my ORCID record. And I also saw that some other people I went into the record had already downloaded it and someone had blogged about it. And that was before this session. And I think the increasing, more and more that the persistent identifiers can be used and that they kind of talk to each other, speak to each other in these systems such as Scholex, and other functionalities, if you like, grant IDs, organisational IDs, can automate these processes and systems. I think that is going to start making a difference. I think at the same time, we should also be thinking about what can be taken away from the researcher workload. I mean, are there things that we as publishers or repository, whoever else is working with the researchers, are there things that they're still being asked to do that actually they don't really need to do anymore? Again, there might be something in the system which is part of a legacy requirement. Formatting references might be one of those things, for instance.
Okay, thank you all very much. I haven't got time for my question, but I'll ask it anyway, but you won't have to answer it. I was just, one of the groups we haven't really discussed is the role of the institution in fair data, and both in as a potential repository of data, but also in terms of their own intellectual property, and maybe that could be one for over lunch. Thank you, everyone.